Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. Today we are talking about empathy. And just to get us started, I'm going to show you a little clip by Brené Brown. A lot of you have probably heard of Brené Brown. She's done a lot of research and TED Talks on topics like shame and vulnerability. So if you haven't heard of her, then definitely Google her and have a look at some of her other stuff. But here's a little clip on empathy by Brené Brown.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So hopefully you enjoyed that video, and I really like it. I mean, it's a kind of a layperson's introduction to empathy, but I like it because it reminds us about this tendency that we have to silver line things, and that's just a basic human tendency that we all have, to try and make people better and try and help them see the positives in their situation, and how that can be unhelpful and the opposite of empathy, because it doesn't take where the person's at and how they're feeling into account. So let's find out more about what this term empathy is about. So if you do some kind of literature search, you'll see that there's years and years and years and years of writings about empathy. And usually when something's not very easily defined or grasped, like empathy, you'll find a lot of writings about it and people trying to understand it or grapple with what it means. The modern use of empathy, it came from a German writer who coined the term, and I cannot say that word. And it's kind of evolved since then, and now it's really regarded as the process of entering or being with a person's suffering or passion. And nowadays, certainly in the counselling field, we look to theorists like Carl Rogers, for example, to think about what empathy means in the therapeutic context. So Carl Rogers has a few things to say about it, as you might imagine. To be with another in this way means that for the time being, you lay aside the views and values you hold for yourself in order to enter another's world without prejudice. In some sense, it means that you lay aside yourself, and this can only be done by a person who's secure enough in himself that he knows he'll not get lost in what may turn out to be the strange or bizarre world of the other, and can comfortably return to his own world when he wishes. Perhaps this description makes clear that being empathic is a complex, demanding, strong yet subtle and gentle way of being. And I agree with Carl Rogers there in that being empathic is complex, and it requires an ability to be vulnerable. It requires self-knowledge. It requires humility as well. Another nice quote from Rogers: the state of empathy or being empathic is to perceive the internal frame of reference of another with accuracy and with the emotional components and meanings which pertain thereto as if one were the person, but without ever losing the as if condition. And that's a very important point to make, that we're experiencing a person's world and perspectives as if we were there too, but we're never actually putting ourselves into that situation or identifying too closely. There always needs to be a distance between the client's experience and our experience. We always need to keep in mind that the two experiences are different. So we can divide empathy into three different categories in terms of how it's used or the purpose and outcome of it. The first one, which is arguably the most important in some ways, and probably the most difficult, I would say, to get a handle on and to learn along the way, is the experiential. And that involves a way of being with a person, or a feeling or an attitude you have towards the client. It means feeling unconditional positive regard to your client. So that means seeing the value in them, regardless of what they might have said or done, or their viewpoint on life or anything like that. So seeing that the person has value in front of you. And understanding their internal frame of reference, understanding how they see the world. The key to showing empathy in an experiential way is that we must be consistent. So that unconditional positive regard must always be there. And it's a disciplined opening of yourself to another. So it can't be, the client isn't very engaged today, so I'm going to disapprove of them, or I'm going to disengage from them or be rejecting of them. The only way that experiential empathy can be really useful in a therapeutic context is that if it's always there. And that can be incredibly healing for clients who have experienced inconsistent attachment from their parents or, other key figures in their life. And that feeling of, that I approve of you and I care about you, being consistently there can be extremely healing. So experiential empathy can include feelings, so feeling for someone. It can also include feelings in your body that you get as a result of the in-the-moment experience with the client. So a client might be telling you a story, or you might be feeling something in response to the way the client is coming across. For example, you know, maybe a client is feeling really anxious about coming to see you, and really anxious about whether the fact that you can help them or not. And you might feel that anxiety in your chest too. And sometimes you can use that feeling to connect with the anxiety the client's feeling too. The feelings of being overwhelmed, you can tap into that sometimes with a client, or just tension in the room, you can tap into that. You can sometimes draw on your intuition to an extent with experiential empathy. So that can mean picking up on something in the room that might not be said by the client. So maybe the client says everything's okay, but you sense that there's something underneath there. There's something going on for the client. And you can draw on that, and whether that's, you know, that influences you scheduling a follow-up session with a client, or it's taking a bit more time to assess and to ask some really open questions of the client and giving them enough space to explore. We can use those intuitions to guide what we do. But it's really important that we maintain a sense of what is intuition and what are our biases and assumptions and so on. So we need to keep a check on that to make sure that our intuition isn't the only thing that we're drawing on. So how do we experience experiential empathy? Well, sometimes we can just have moments where we can try and identify with the client what it must be like to be that person, what it must be like to be homeless, or what it must be like to be living with someone who's addicted to a substance, or what it must be like to be someone who's deeply depressed, and try and get a sense of that. And sometimes we can draw on our own experiences in life, and while that might be, those experiences in our own life might be at a smaller scale or lower intensity, we can still use those experiences to relate to other people's stories. So for example, I do a lot of couples counselling, and sometimes you'll get one partner in the couples therapy who's quite defensive. And at first glance, that can, you know, be off-putting for a therapist, and it can, you know, maybe lead you to think, oh, they're not, you know, they're not in this for, you know, to improve the relationship. They're not committed, or that kind of thing. But a much more productive way to approach that would be to try and connect with that feeling of defensiveness. And maybe there's been a time when you've had someone in your life that was criticizing you, or you felt attacked by someone, and try and access what that felt like. Did you feel like you constantly needed to defend yourself, or to explain yourself, or to show that you're not all bad? Did you feel ashamed of yourself? Did you feel vulnerable? So if we can try and momentarily identify with the client, it can help us feel empathy towards someone that might be even displaying quite difficult behaviours. But it's really important that that is only momentary. So we must do that just in a very quick way, and then come back to ourselves, because we don't want to spend too much time thinking about our own experiences, which takes us away from focusing on the client. And Godfrey Barrett-Leonard, I was very lucky enough to work alongside him at Murdoch in the counselling program there. And he's written a lot about empathy and person-centred approaches. So have a look for his work if you can. He says that it's the other's distinct and separate consciousness that is reached and bridged from the self of the therapist in moments of deep consciousness. So it's about reaching across and bridging our experiences in order to empathize experientially with the client. It's important to maintain the as-if quality of empathy, like I said before. So that's having some kind of background awareness that the feelings in the room belong to the other person. They're not our feelings, and we mustn't take them on. And I like this quote also by Reich, who compares identifying with a client, or that idea of momentarily trying to imagine what it's like for them. What really happens in the, so he compares that with tasting food. What really happens in the conjecture phase is that we get just a taste of the menu, no more, just enough so that our tongue and palate recognize the food. And I really love that. It's about just getting a taste of that feeling and that experience, and then moving back into our role as counsellor. So as I have talked with my tutorial group about, in this way, everything that happens in our lives can be used to help us empathise with people in all different walks of life and experiences. Even though our experiences are different and the intensity of those situations might be different, we can still use them. And so that's why, as you get more experience and have more life experience as well, you become a better counsellor because you can empathise with a wider range of experiences. So categories of empathy. Communicative. Now, for a while in the literature, the communicative category of empathy was really focused on, and I think the theorists lost sight of the importance of the experiential use of empathy, and it was just focused on how do we say that we feel empathy. But both of them are extremely important. So moving on to how do we express empathy, or how do we reflect empathy? Well, it's a way of accurately expressing to a person that we hear and understand. And the accurately is important because we need to listen very, very carefully for the words and the tone that the person's using in order to accurately express that back. We can also look at the underlying emotion that a client is giving across, and sometimes they might not always make their feelings explicit, but we can help them by trying to unearth those and feed them back, as long as they're accurate. It can help the client make their emotional life more clear, which can help them therefore manage those feelings. In order for an empathic response of a therapist to affect a client, it needs to be expressed. So it's not enough that we feel empathy for a client. We need to show them, we need to tell them in some way. And expressing your sense of what their experience and meaning is helps them explore more deeply. So to hear back how you've heard them and how you think they're experiencing this problem or their situation can help them go more deeply into that exploration. Now, some of you were saying that when you were using paraphrasing, you felt that after a little while it just stayed at a surface level, whereas reflecting back on feelings can help the client go a little bit deeper and explore a little deeper. We need to make sure we're not making assumptions outside of what the client has communicated. So we're not putting a theory as to why the client might be feeling the way they are. What we're trying to draw out is the feelings that we're picking up from the words the client's saying, rather than trying to diagnose a client or give them a reason for why they're feeling a certain way. We need to go on what they're saying to us. And this is a nice quote by Barrett Leonard, spelled incorrectly there. It is as though this response helps an inner door to open in the other person, and what lies beyond the door is now visible. As they examine and share this vista and experience the listener following and seeing with them, what they now perceive, another door swings open. Such companioning, step by incremental step, can be powerfully enabling to the person in finding their way. So in the focus on trying to communicate empathy, there have been a number of different measures or scales to try and measure how accurate our empathy is in terms of empathic responding. And this scale is one example, and it's probably the most commonly used scale. But it gives you just a sense of what would be considered, a moderately high level of empathic responding. And generally what we're aiming for is trying to feed back what the client's saying accurately, and also listening for implicit feelings or unsaid feelings as well, and feeding them back. So that would be around level 4. And finally, we have the observational category of empathy. And so Kohut wrote that the process of understanding and explaining is a means of moving from a lower form of empathy to a higher form of empathy. And what that means is trying to use empathy to understand the whole picture and to put it into some kind of model helps us move towards really understanding a client's world. We can then apply that model that we've developed on a client's world to the theory that we have. So that's, depending on what theoretical approach you end up using, then we can apply that full understanding of their experience to the theory of, for example, cognitive behaviour therapy or narrative therapy. And then ultimately we can come up with an intervention plan based on our understanding of the client, the theory, and the intervention that would be indicated. So observational empathy, unlike experiential empathy, involves looking at the whole picture. So experiential empathy is about the immediate here and now, what's actually happening in the room. Whereas observational empathy is thinking about everything a client has told you and how they come across in the room and so on, to get a bigger picture. And sometimes feeding back that kind of working model you have with the client of what's contributed to their problem, the context to their experience, so the developmental context in terms of their family structure and things that have happened to them in their lives, and possibly intergenerational issues as well. Feeding that kind of story back and a kind of an understanding of what's led them to this point in time can be exceptionally helpful for a client. But it must be accurate. So it must be built on the client's particular experience of their world. It can't be, well, according to Jungian theory, you are experiencing this issue because of this, this, and this. No, it must come from the client's experience for it to be accurate and useful. And we also need to be flexible in terms of letting that model evolve over time. So as you're working with a client, our decision making around treatment plans and working model of their experience changes over time as we get more insight and more information. So I need to be constantly evolving. So what are the barriers to empathy? Well, one of the major barriers is confusing empathy with sympathy. And we saw a little bit about that in the Brené Brown video. So often what happens when you feel sympathy for a client is that you're trying to change how they feel or save them from their distress, rather than trying to understand their distress and be kind of in it, but not in it with them. So that idea of getting down into the hole with the person who's feeling overwhelmed and alone, rather than kind of shouting out some kind of advice or like saying, oh, let me know if you need anything kind of thing. Sympathy comes from a place of the sharing of pain. So, sometimes you see someone who's grieving a lost parent, for example, and you think, oh gosh, I can't imagine what that must be like. I would hate to lose my mum. And so you want to take away or avoid that feeling of distress that the client has because it's uncomfortable for you. So often the sharing of sympathy can be more about our own needs or our own feelings than about the client's, even though it's coming from a good place. We could, if we're feeling sympathy, sometimes you find yourself saying, oh, that sounds so horrific, because you're imagining what it would be like for yourself. Or I feel so angry at her for doing that to you. So that's really over-identifying with the client, which kind of encourages them to see themselves as a victim, and maybe cuts off exploration of different paths they could take, or different ways they could look at a situation. Also, I know how you feel. That's often unhelpful, because generally, how do we know how someone else feels exactly? So all we can do is try and feed back as accurately as we can what we think they feel, so they can tell us or not that we're on the right track. Other things like tacitly agreeing with the client, such as a client says, I'm just not a relationship type person. And the counsellor says, that's so great that you have that self-awareness. What does that say to the client? Yes, I think you're right. You're not cut out for relationships. Another one, I finally told my boss to go jump. The counsellor says, they didn't appreciate all your hard work. So that communicates to the client that there were no other options, and they agree that they needed to have a go at their boss. And it doesn't really help the client reflect on what was going on for them. So this quote, over-identification with the patient, sharing his defence, his likes and dislikes, his rationalisations. Therapists might enter into conspiracy with him against the world that would not alter the patient's self-alienation. So like we spoke about with facial expressions and so on, we want to avoid colluding with a client when it doesn't serve that client. So we want to avoid agreeing with them when they put themselves down, or agreeing with them when they make an assessment of themselves, or when they're rationalising behaviour that doesn't serve them, or when they have a tendency to think in quite concrete ways, like, oh, nothing ever goes right for me, or everyone's out to get me, and those kinds of things. So it's really important that we don't join with the client in those kinds of patterns of thinking, because ultimately that will make them feel worse over time, and we really want to avoid that. So we want to try and tap into the strengths that the client has. So empathy is about staying focused on the client's perspective. So when you're talking about, you know, someone who's, I feel so angry at her for doing that to you, instead of saying that, you could say you feel really confused by her behaviour. Or about the person who's not a relationship type person, you worry about your ability to be in a relationship. Or you reached a point where you felt you had to say something to your boss. And all of those responses are much more likely to encourage the client to explore more about what they value, what they want out of the situation, and how they feel about it. So when we reflect back what a client's saying, and we reflect back how they're feeling, they will tend to understand how they're feeling a little bit better. It will tend to clarify how they're feeling, and they will often talk more in depth about how they're feeling. They might correct you when you give kind of a description of how you think they might be feeling. They might correct you, and we need to stay open to that. It's really important that we don't cut off exploration or the ability to correct you. So we're not the experts. The client is the expert in how they feel. So a client's understanding of their feelings can often lead them to emotional regulation. So that means a calming down of the overall system, so they can better understand the next course of action they'd like to take. So here's an example. My dad drank a lot when I was growing up, but it didn't bother me so much until now. But I was just home, and it really hurts to see what Dad's starting to do to my mum. She's awful quiet, you know. Why she takes so much, I don't know. But like I was saying, Mum and I were sitting there one night drinking coffee, and he came in, stumbled over the doorstep, and then he got angry. He started to hit my mother, and I stopped him. I almost hit him myself, I was so angry. I worry about Mum. So what could we say? So if we think about the content of that, in terms of paraphrasing we did last week, the content was around his father's drinking history, his mother's quietness and submission, and of course the difficult situation when Thomas was last home. So paraphrasing shows that you've heard what he said and encourages him to go forward. So Thomas, I hear you saying that your father has been drinking a long time, your mother puts up with a lot, but now he's started to be violent and you're tempted to hit him yourself. Have I heard you right? And that kind of encapsulates most of what he said. In regards to the feelings that you've noticed, the words that stick out are really hurts, angry, and worry. So if you wanted to feed back a basic reflection of feeling, it could be, you know, it really hurt, or you feel angry, or you're worried. And that's a basic reflection because they use the client's exact words. So you know they're going to be accurate. So there's a few different levels of learning how to do empathic responding. The first one is making a formula response. And it's a really good way to get started, to really focus on, you know, making sure you're getting the accurate feeling and the accurate content. It might feel artificial, but as you go along and get more experience, you can start to use more sophisticated ways of showing empathy. So to start with, you want to use the formula. So you feel angry because your mother forgot to pick you up. Yeah. So pretty simple. Do you feel because this? However, sometimes a client story is not quite so straightforward. So sometimes they might give you multiple feelings, and you want to make sure you respond to those multiple feelings. So you can respond to those in a few different ways. So you can use the you feel this because formula twice, or you can state both feelings up front and follow up with the content. So you both feel sad and excited because your friend is leaving, and excited about the potential of meeting new people. So that should say you feel both, anyway, you feel a couple of feelings: sad because your friend's leaving and excited about possibly meeting new people. So it's important that we don't just focus on one feeling, because when there's mixed feelings, that's a feeling in itself. Yeah. And then when we've got the hang of making formula responses, so you feel because, we can start to weave our empathic responses into a more of a natural style. So that's when you use your own personality style in the response. And we all have different ways of talking and responding, so it makes it much more unique and natural. So it sounds scary to be around Jason right now, even though you're not worried about your physical safety. So you can see there that you're reflecting back two feelings: scared and not worried or not concerned. Yeah. But it's in a more natural manner. And then we can make more advanced empathic responses. So that's by reflecting feelings that are not expressed by the client, but you're able to sense that there are deeper feelings than, for example, anger. Often with anger, there's something underneath that. And so sometimes we're able to pick up that a client's feeling actually quite hurt by a situation. We're able to reflect back. So it sounds like he might be feeling quite hurt by the situation as well as angry. And that can actually help a client access those softer feelings, which can help them actually move forward to figuring out how to deal with those. You can use metaphor. I use metaphor a lot to describe situations or to describe techniques or strategies and that kind of thing. And I usually just make them up on the spot to fit the client. So something like, it sounds like she's always been your rock, or so it feels like your relationship is a house on shaky foundations. Or we can reflect back contrasting feelings. So if a client's feeling a few different feelings, we can reflect those back, which helps the client understand that the relative depth of both feelings. So when we're working with feelings and trying to feed those back, as a first step, some of you are probably really across feeling words, but sometimes we need to work on expanding our vocabulary of emotions. And I've just got a couple of little cheat sheets for you here. So we need to make sure when we're feeding back feelings that we're using the right family of feelings. So you can see here that in the family of sad, you've got lots of different expressions of that. You've got depressed, you've got dejected, you've got crushed, you've got upset, sorrowful, weepy, dismayed, all quite different experiences. So we need to listen really carefully and try and feed back the correct one, or the closest one we can come up with. Helped, so we can feel saved versus accepted, also quite different. So have a look through those and try and increase your vocabulary a little bit. We also want to make sure that we get the right intensity of emotion. So we don't want to be feeding back that someone's feeling furious when they're just feeling annoyed. So this picture indicates the different intensities of feelings people can have, and gives you a clue of how to feed those back. So reflection of feeling is a very important skill. We need to use empathy and reflection of feelings in our counselling sessions, but it can be overdone. So we need to make sure that we don't overdo empathy, and that we don't kill them with kindness, essentially. So usually just a short and accurate reflection is helpful. It can be overwhelming for a client to hear so much, oh, you know, it sounds so difficult, oh, and, you know, it sounds like you're really upset about this, or, you know, that kind of thing. That can be too much. Briefly identifying unspoken feelings can be helpful too. Sometimes clients are not comfortable with you commenting on their feelings, and so briefly do it and move on. Some clients like to start off more cognitively, and then briefly bringing in their feelings can be done more and more as you go along and build that relationship. I like this little cartoon where it says, the guy saying, what's wrong? I don't know. How can I help? I don't know. Okay, I made a nest. You want to come? Okay. Does that help? Yes. Are you ever coming out? No. Okay, hang on. And he gets into the nest with him. And sometimes it's the being with someone, the trying to understand another's world, and companioning them in that world can be really powerful and healing for someone. Sometimes we don't have to do much more than that. We don't have to have all these fancy skills and techniques. Sometimes they are really useful, but sometimes it's just being with the person where they're at that makes a difference. So there's two parts to the lecture today. I'd really like you to now look at the video on Blackboard to give you an example of a session using paraphrasing and reflection of feeling. There's a few questions in there too, so you can get a sense of how a session can evolve using empathy and paraphrasing. And in our tutorials, we're going to be practicing some basic paraphrasing. If you feel like you're more confident with basic empathy. If you feel more confident with empathy, you can start to use more conversationally based empathy. But otherwise, just stick to the formula. So you feel because, and see how you go. All right, thank you.